retailers that make it clear at checkout that wait an extra day and you'll save a plane flight, over time or
Yeah.
something like that. I would like to see even more retailers doing that because I don't think some consumers are onto it, but I don't think most consumers know that shipping slower is probably the most impactful thing you could do as a consumer.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Clean Techies podcast, where we interview climate tech founders and VCs to discuss all things building and investing to solve the biggest challenge of our generation, climate change. This is episode 87 of the show. I'm your host, Silas Maynor, and thank you for joining us on today's episode. If you are a returning listener, we are asking for your help in two ways today, very specifically. One, we ask that you please, if you have not already, subscribe and go follow us on YouTube as well. As you know, a lot of effort is put into this show. Well, maybe you don't know, but if you are a podcaster, you probably know how much effort goes into producing a show. So we really appreciate your support on the listener side. Second thing, if you do, again, a returning listener, we'd like you to send this episode to two people that you know. So very specifically, one person that you think will like this content, somebody who probably agrees with you, maybe you chat with them about the space often, and then one person who you think might disagree with this content. We always like to see and kind of like poke the bear a little bit, see what they think, and maybe someday, who knows, maybe they'll change their mind. So this would really help us spread the show, spread the word of the show. So please help us in that way with subscribing and sharing. And then, of course, if you're returning and you haven't already, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, especially. It's very, very helpful for our continued growth. And before we get into the episode details, any notes for a note for founders listening. If you're looking to raise capital or looking for particular partnerships and you're a founder in space, reach out, and I'm always glad to help in any way that I can by making those introductions. I do it pretty regularly, so feel free to reach out. And a big thanks to NextWave Partners for sponsoring this show. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you're looking to make a career change, reach out to NextWave at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. All right, so let's get into the episode details. If you are a bit of a shipping nerd like me, this is going to be a great episode for you. We are joined by James Malley, the co-founder of Paccurate, Paccurate, where they are helping product shippers use smaller boxes, so less air is shipped essentially, resulting in fewer trucks to get the same products to your destination. So this is a juggernaut of a business, as they are able to service a ginormous a number of companies and sizes of companies with a very light staff. And it all came out to just being experts in solving annoying problems in the shipping space, right? That's how they got started ultimately. In this conversation, we talk about the shipping industry as a whole, including packaging materials and incentives. I thought that was a pretty interesting angle that we talked about, as well as how the government is bringing regulation surrounding Scope 3 emissions coming to a store or a country near you. And how they built their company as well. That was really fun part of the show, of course, to kind of hear their journey and talk about some of the challenges. So really interesting episode. I hope you're into shipping and things of that nature. It may be a boring topic to some people, but I think, if you listen to it from the perspective of trying to reduce the carbon emissions and the impacts, it is very, very exciting if you put it that way, even if you don't like shipping. So if you're at all interested in shipping products, it should be a great episode for you. If not, maybe skip to the second half where he talks about building the company. That'll at least be helpful for any founders listening. So without any further delay, let's get into it. All right. Welcome to the show, James. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Super, super excited to have you on. This is pretty interesting and exciting conversation for me. I think I put it in my show notes here to mention. For those who don't know, I had a company called Mate a while ago. It's just like a really small side project I worked on. And at one point, I got really nerdy about the shipping costs and like minimizing things. I was really, really into it. So this is a pretty interesting conversation, but in the lens of sustainability. So I guess why don't we start from the beginning and just tell us a little bit about yourself and a kind of a quick intro of the key highlights.
Sure. So my name's James Malley. Today I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Paccurate. We provide solutions that help companies like Mate figure out how to pack shipments more efficiently. And do analysis to make sure their box sizes are right for their operation. Before that, kind of years of freelancing and logistics tech before we decided to build something that we owned.
Interesting. So is it mostly just from the actual shipper's perspective, or is it also from the people packing the vans and moving that? Is it more so focused on the actual packaging of the product?
Yeah, so we support, LTL and TL, so we can help with, pallet loads and truckloads and stuff, but our kind of, method that we invented actually drives the most value at the parcel level. And it's definitely the parcel level, like each package, optimizing each shipment is what we're most fascinated by. Because kind of any sort of tweak you do at that level really bubbles up through the whole supply chain. So that's kind of where we focus.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I have a question that we might ask about later, but can we talk more broadly about packaging as a whole? Could you maybe speak about kind of what's the approximate waste per package currently, if you have any data points on this, and when space is wasted, what are the negative byproducts of that?
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing about packing these boxes, so in a fulfillment center, you have, your shelves full of stuff, and then orders get dropped in, and then some people at the pack stations have these boxes that they choose from to box up your stuff so they can put it on a truck. And we found that a couple of things. I mean, more broadly, even people that do this, as their job, they're usually under pressure to do it as quickly as possible. But even if they weren't, humans are just kind of inherently bad at looking at three-dimensional space and kind of understanding what they're looking at. And we are too, because we look at packing solutions all day long and totally, misjudge the percentage fill. But what we find is when we go into a shipper like Crate and Barrel, we'll find around a square foot of cardboard minimum per carton that we can save just by having an algorithm figure it out instead of a human. And anywhere between 10 and 20% of the cubic volume of that package on average. In terms of the sustainability stats, it's a lot easier to calculate for the material. I think it's for every ton of cardboard manufactured, it creates 3 tons of CO2 equivalent. It's a little bit more complicated on the supply chain side. We do know that if you can reduce the average size of your packages, you're going to use, by 14% or something, you're going to use the same exact percent less trucks. So 14% fewer, smaller packages on average, 14% fewer trucks over time.
Interesting. So how did you go from kind of being in this logistics space to specifically getting into the sustainability aspect of it?
We kind of, I would say, first of all, our team is like extremely passionate about the sustainability side of what we do. It's most of what we talk about internally. But my co-founder, Pat, who's our CTO and who really architected most of our tech, or all of our tech really, we kind of backed up into the sustainability benefits. We kind of started working on the problem because we had all these clients from our freelance days. And it was around the same time that FedEx and UPS started penalizing poor packing more than they had been. And so some of these shippers were like, Pat, James, what do we do? Like, there's not really a good solution for getting this under control. It wasn't really until we got big customers that we were seeing the numbers of, well, wait a second. At scale, this customer is going to save, 100 acres of cardboard in their, first 6 months or whatever. So I think that we had a hunch there was a sustainability benefit, but we didn't really become gung-ho about solving the problem and the problem itself until we started to see those actual numbers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. What time was this roughly? This came about?
Oh man, I think we started like noodling on the problem in like 2016. We didn't really start taking it seriously until 2018. And then, our customer base kind of started to blow up at the beginning of the pandemic. So there was a bit of a progression there.
Yeah, it's interesting, I think, to look into these things from when they played out in time, obviously with the the hype cycles of ESG and sustainability as they kind of come and go and seem to be more sticky as they continue to go along. I'm kind of curious to know a little bit about, before we kind of get into the operating of the company, could you talk a little bit about the actual materials being used in shipping? Is there a lot of innovation you're seeing there, or is it pretty standard? Maybe just help fill people in who are unfamiliar with the space as a whole.
Sure. Um, there's nothing really on the horizon that is going to replace that cardboard box that shows up on your doorstep, at least not that I've seen. There's a lot of interesting stuff being done with the mailers, which are great to kind of introduce into the pack station to save as much space as possible. There's a little bit of a battle going on right now between plastic mailers and paper mailers, because plastic not great, but it can be cheaper in many ways. So there's a little bit of back and forth there. I think some of the most exciting stuff is actually happening with fill material, particularly for cold chain. You've got a lot of like compostable materials going in, and the only thing that's really stopping that from instantly taking over is the cost. So we should see over the next few years, as those costs continue to kind of come down, or at least don't rise as fast as some of the other commodity fill materials out there, we should see a lot greener stuff. I mean, it used to be, we used to see styrofoam packing peanuts exploding out of your box when you order something, but thankfully we don't see that as much anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about it because obviously, I mean, for those unfamiliar with the packing space, you can't just use any material, right? You want to keep it light because usually, if I'm not mistaken, you're usually priced based off of weight, correct? For most shipping things.
Yeah, so weight is like the primary driver of cost. However, that's the thing that really changed and caused us to get involved in the problem, is that FedEx and UPS and the other carriers realized, well, wait a second, we've got truckloads of mostly empty boxes here. We're just charging them based on weight. So rather than just switch to, we're going to charge you for size, they said, we're going to come up with an imaginary stand-in for weight that just happens to take density into account. And they call it dimensional weight. Yeah, so that's kind of how they started to penalize that.
Yeah. Well, I guess one other thing on the topic of the actual materials I'm curious about is, what about the cardboard itself? How recyclable is it actually?
It's actually great. It's sort of the material that humans have figured out how to recycle really well. Um, and this is what we have to say a lot, is just because it's way better than plastic doesn't mean it's a miracle, and an amazing get out of jail free material. Like, there is a carbon footprint associated with recycling it and with making new corrugate. So it's the best thing we have at the moment, but still pretty emittive.
Mm-hmm. Is a lot of that going to be reducible because of the energy? Like, if they can get renewable energy to in the recycling process, will that significantly kind of reduce the actual carbon impacts?
It could be, but that's when you think about how this stuff is made, it goes through so many different steps, from assuming you're starting from scratch, logging,
Yeah.
processing the material. There's byproducts and all these things. So um, this is where ESG exercises get fairly complicated, and maybe too complicated for people that are kind of casually interested in sustainability initiatives
Yeah.
to stick with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think it's interesting. I think I've seen, maybe you can comment on this. Are there any novel, maybe not, again, not necessarily scalable yet, but any novel packagings that you've seen? I think I've heard people talking about using seaweed to create packaging. I'm just kind of curious if you've seen anything out there.
I definitely follow some of those inventions. I guess where we kind of are most exposed to the things that are produced at scale. So mid to large size retailers, what is reliable and sort of affordable enough for them to deploy. So we haven't really seen, aside from film material, we haven't seen a whole lot in the way of like greener carton material, for example. I know there was a kind of uh, a wave of interest in maybe doing reusable shipping containers, and that's maybe more appropriate for some things rather than others, like cold chain or something. But yeah, for the moment, it's just cardboard.
Hmm. Yeah, that is interesting. I've thought about that with, when I got my when I moved into a new apartment, I tried to buy the most sustainable that I could find kind of containers for packaging things. But then you sometimes think about it. But if you use these, okay, how long will they actually last? Is it worth the weight cost, especially when you're shipping that many things, right? It really can add up significantly. You talked about this a little bit with the changing kind of landscape in the companies like FedEx and UPS kind of changing the incentives. I was curious to hear more about the incentives that you think could be done to help improve this space more. Are there other areas where there's a lot of improvement still there and available?
Yeah, I think, so we think about this problem very myopically almost, because we're looking at cartons, we're looking at everything that affects the packing decision. So it's not just making smaller ones, it's making, choosing the right boxes for what kind of vehicle your shipment's going to go on. But even with that in mind, we're still kind of looking at this one part of supply chain. Um, we like to call it, the atomic level, because it's like the individual kind of pieces that are moving through it. But the other kind of most, at least in my view, the other kind of most important piece of um, e-commerce fulfillment, but supply chain in general, is the way that these things are moved around in general. So more, we see a lot of innovation in the micro fulfillment side. Last mile becoming a little bit closer to home. Just things that make it so that these packages don't have to go as far and tax as much of the transport network as they do today. That's kind of the other half of, I don't know if you've heard the term the physical internet, but it's kind of a concept of, if we can move supply chain to act more like the internet does, with links and nodes and shared resources. That's really, in my view, kind of the future of supply chain when it comes to sustainability.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I also feel like it's difficult because in order to do that, there might be some sacrifices on time, right? And I think that people have become so used to 2 day shipping that I mean, at least I do, especially like, I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, you can't get this to me in 2 days? This is crazy. When, 10 years ago, that would have been insane to think that in the first place, right? But I do see some of those initiatives, like with Amazon mentioning, hey, choose your Amazon day, so that way you're shipping fewer things and it's coming together. Do you see that consumers are, I guess, getting to a point where they think they'll be more willing to wait in order to have a more sustainable supply chain?
I think it really depends on what you're ordering. When I order a toothbrush from Amazon, it's because I need to brush my teeth
Yeah.
sooner rather than later. If I'm ordering, something maybe from another merchant and it's just, something special that I want, I will choose a slower shipping option. And I think, retailers that make it clear at checkout that, like, wait an extra day and you'll save a plane flight, over time or
Yeah.
something like that. I would like to see even more retailers doing that, because I don't think um, some consumers are onto it, but I don't think most consumers know that shipping slower is probably the most impactful thing you could do as a consumer.
Interesting. I'm definitely gonna have to clip that. That's a good point. One thing we were talking about with the shipping companies around things that they're doing to incentivize the actual uh, kind of product creators. Are there any potential regulations that you see coming down the pipeline, or is it relatively just self-regulated that you see kind of coming in the future here?
Oh yeah, big time. So right now, FedEx and UPS and others are concerned about scope, 1 and 2 emissions. So they have an incentive as public companies to make those numbers as small as possible, which is why you see, trials and deployments of electric vehicles and, programs to help their customers become more green, et cetera, et cetera. But there is law in the EU about scope 3 emissions. which, as you likely know, are the emissions that you kind of cause outside your four walls. That is coming here. It faces some hurdles of, lawsuits from big industry and all that stuff, but it's going to happen because it's really the only way that we can kind of collectively get together on emissions in general, is to have scope 3 be regulated. And so once that happens, there's going to be this switch where instead of the carriers kind of pushing hard for this sort of space efficiency and their, making sure their capacity is as not taxed as possible, you're suddenly going to see all the public companies like retailers being like, now we have to report these scope 3 emissions that are from the boxes, the trucks that we're requiring FedEx to use. That is going to hit like a ton of bricks for companies that aren't prepared for it.
Interesting. So just to make sure I understood that, the actual companies shipping, not the companies providing the delivery, those are the companies that are going to be most impacted.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you're a big retailer, and you are using 40% more FedEx trucks than you absolutely need to, you're going to have a pretty embarrassing scope 3 emissions score compared to other retailers that have maybe done a better job.
Mm-hmm. And out of curiosity, because that's a very complicated thing to do, to track these items, do you see a lot of infrastructure being set up to achieve actually tracking that, where FedEx is maybe already reporting into the shippers of the products, hey, here's what's actually going on with your products that we're shipping? And is that already getting pretty well set up and prepared for that tracking?
It's going to be fits and starts, for sure. So the government is like got proposals out for how to score and keep track of these things. I've been following some startups that have come out with these really interesting ESG tools that have kind of calculations built into them. I would say for us, like, that is one of the most common reasons we start having a conversation with a retailer, because they know there's a problem. It's sort of more of a hunch. They say, we notice our largest box always has 37 air pillows in it when we ship it. Does that sound bad? And so we do an analysis and tell them, here's the impact of that by the numbers, and here's what you could be doing differently. But to your question, it's really everybody in the supply chain that's going to be on the hook one way or the other for making this stuff more efficient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. What about from this is something that you may not have insight into, but from the actual box makers, right? Let's just talk about cardboard, right? From the people creating these boxes, do they already have set up to help kind of track how much emissions is coming from for each box, and are they going deeper into their supply chains, et cetera? Is that something you see already happening?
I do. Manufacturers like International Paper, Georgia Pacific, are getting pretty serious about this stuff. And I'm like, I was born kind of a cynic, and kind of pessimistic about the fate of the earth. But I have been, really encouraged by just the way that these folks make decisions about what to be transparent on, what they're willing to give up. I mean, we get most of our kind of referrals from packaging providers, including corrugate manufacturers. And they know that if their customers use us, that they're going to be selling less material. But they say they don't care. And that's been like kind of the satisfying part of this, is actually getting a glimpse into like the actual people at these companies. Like, they want to do good. Like, they want to make the supply chain less wasteful. So that's been really kind of a gift for me to be encouraged by that.
Yeah, I mean that's quite interesting. You would assume that, especially some of these are big companies, right? There's probably so many, bureaucratic levels to it where they're all incentivized to sell as much paper as possible, right? But if they're doing that, that is really encouraging. Thanks for sharing that. That's quite interesting. I think that's a pretty good. Well, maybe one last thing on this kind of point, generally on the shipping side, is, do you have rough data that you've been able to scrape together on actually how much carbon emissions can be saved. Say for example, um, if maximum efficiency was achieved and how many trucks you could reduce actually shipping, like what's the carbon kind of impact in a good way?
So we're working with academics to try to figure out the supply chain side of it. So if I eliminate 400 trucks a year, and these are the trucks that pull up to my warehouse that I load with all these packed packages, and then they go off to a hub somewhere to go to their final destination. That's a very complicated kind of
Yeah.
project. So while we're working on that, we kind of more are fixated on the easy math, like I said at the top, about material. Because material manufacture, especially for this stuff, is pretty well documented. So we can, if somebody comes in and says, all right, what if maybe it's not even a packing kind of exercise. They say, what if my flagship widget that I sell on my website were a quarter of an inch shorter? How would that affect the size of my cartons and my material usage over the next year, 5 years, whatever. So that's the stuff. I mean, you talked about being sucked into the parcel pricing stuff. This is the kind of thing that just turns you into a huge nerd once you spend more than 5 minutes on it.
No, I mean, honestly, it is very fun. I remember getting into it because I was like, oh man, if I did this and this, and if I make sure that I ask the manufacturer to do this little tiny thing differently, it would be so much better.
Yeah.
And it is a lot of fun. I think it might stem from growing up. I worked in my dad's cabinet shop, and he knew exactly how big every piece of plywood was. So he would somehow, in a lot of ways, design his cabinet so that he could have literally sawdust left when he was making out the cut sheets, right? So I think it maybe stems from that idea of taking everything into account. But this is really helpful. I think this is very interesting. Obviously, a lot of impact can be made here. Let's talk a little bit more about building the business now. So
Sure.
can you talk to us about, so it sounded like if I got that correct, that your co-founder kind of had this idea for a way to quantify this, but could you just talk us through the whole process of coming up with the actual technology itself, and maybe walk us through the early days of getting started? Would be really keen to understand your mindset around going from consulting to building a real company and doing these things actually. Just kind of really curious about that, the whole process
Sure.
and journey.
So my co-founder and I went to high school together, so we've known each other many, many years. We had attempted some startups right after college that kind of flamed out spectacularly. And so after that, we're like, all right, let's just go, use our skills. And so we freelanced, and we eventually kind of acquired this reputation for doing difficult, well, maybe not difficult. We would always get really annoying projects, like projects that nobody else wanted to deal with. So like shipping software companies would come to us if there was a tough integration that required all these moving pieces. And anyway, so we did that for a few years, and we just got kind of burnt out on putting out other people's fires. And so, when our clients, the shippers, the brands, started coming to us with this problem, we kind of jumped at it because it was really the first time that we heard it from multiple sides of that. How do I deal with this? And so in the beginning, it was just Pat and I. I think I made the first version of the technology, and it was terrible. It barely worked. And then Pat went away and said, "Let me noodle on this for a while." And we eventually developed what we were able to patent, which was a whole new method for solving this problem. Instead of just trying to make smaller boxes, it's more of kind of a cost reconciliation exercise. So in milliseconds, at the pack station, we take labor cost, material cost, and waste, and carrier rate tables, and those all get kind of reconciled together, and then a packing decision is made. So the actual underlying tech is pretty mature. I mentioned Crate and Barrel. There's a bunch of kind of retailers like that using it for just because of that method we came up with. A few months ago, we released our first kind of platform application that's more of a simulation tool. So you can introduce variables, and it'll simulate all of your packing and shipping and let you kind of answer questions about, other kind of projects that you might have going on at the company. So yeah, that's kind of the evolution of things up till today.
Mhm. So just to clarify then, so the technology, this is essentially a software that these companies can use on their own. They don't require, an external consultant to come in and help them, maybe with setup and understanding it, but overall it's something that can integrate into their existing workforce.
Yeah, I mean, it's a stateless API, so they don't have to configure it, configure anything on our side. They just call our API endpoint, usually from their warehouse management system that already has all the information we need. And we send back packing instructions that has a little 3D picture of which boxes to choose and how to pack them, and that usually gets thrown up on a screen at a pack station or used to drive box making machinery automatically.
Mm-hmm. And so how do you, I guess my question would be, how do you take the data that you know about the shippers, trying to help kind of condense what they need to do and how big their products are, and then act as kind of a go-between the actual package makers and even perhaps going back again to the manufacturers, right? Maybe there's an existing box that's already there. Obviously, I'm assuming boxes are easier to make than a new product, right? So is there any way that you're enabling these companies to kind of talk to each other to ensure there's a better fit coming together along the way?
Yeah, well, I think this kind of speaks to what I was talking about with being optimistic by, with how packaging distributors and manufacturers are thinking about the future of their business, where they don't look at us as a threat because, they know that we are of the three R's, we're the reduce mostly, we're the reduce step. And they see this as being kind of maybe inevitable in some ways of just making things a lot more efficient, so they're selling less material, but they want to be on that same journey with their customers. At least the smart ones do. They don't want to be kind of left behind as this legacy kind of bloated vendor. So I think that has a lot to do with it.
So in many cases, are they already working together to say, hey, here's a new product we have, we want a specialized box for it, or is it oftentimes like kind of off the shelf type of thing?
Yeah, most of the time they already have some sort of relationship with a materials provider. We do get the question a lot, especially with this new tool that we released, which we call Pack Simulate. They ask us, okay, we want greener materials. Can you just tell us which company we should talk to about getting this done in an affordable way? So that was kind of an interesting adjustment too, is going from being so like focused on the math, and then suddenly now people are asking our opinion on other vendors and companies and stuff. So that's how you've been working on a problem for a long time.
Yeah, that is interesting. I've experienced that a little bit with recruitment. What I'm curious about on that topic is how do you determine, because I mean, I'm assuming there's a lot of data that you could collect and are able to start feeding to different individuals or organizations, but how do you decide what to focus on and what data should you collect, what's valuable? Because I'm assuming there's people who want more than just anecdotal information from you saying, well, here's what we usually see. They might want a report or something like that. Is this something you face? And then how do you determine like what should you focus on?
Yeah. So there's the data that we need in order for our products to work. So good dimensional data, and usually some good data about costs, very, disparate costs that are associated with fulfillment. And then on the other side, on the output side, after we do either a packing instruction for one shipment or a big simulation with kind of a, meta-analysis result, that latter kind of result where we're highlighting certain data points, that's kind of a mix of us being reactive to what our customers are looking for when they reach out to us, but it's also, we try to take it as a point to educate people on what we think matters. So like I mentioned, acres of cardboard, that's always like just crazy that we're using that unit of measurement for these companies. It's not
Yeah.
like, it's not square feet, it's acres. And that usually gets a kind of a slack jaw response. And maybe that speaks to not just that we're calling out certain important KPIs, the way you tell the story, so that they can really understand, on an emotional level what you're talking about. That's been a really important journey for us as well.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting. I can imagine that this is something I've encountered, is that folks who are able to kind of fuse really technical things in good storytelling, or more like kind of the soft skills that go along, can be very, very valuable. What have, I don't know, maybe what have some of the biggest challenges been, or I guess just generally speaking, advice to other people, other founders in this kind of space within the sustainability realm, from your experience building the company?
Yeah, I think, you know, in some ways we got lucky because we are solving a problem where sustainability and cost savings are the same thing. I've watched sustainability entrepreneurs, do very well, but there's a lot of friction when there's a much higher cost associated with their greener option that they're selling and bringing to the market. Um, I think there are a lot of other parts of, not just supply chain, but business in general, where if you can just make sure those two things, it making your cost lower and making your emissions fewer. If you can find problems like that to solve where they have two of those things, you will find momentum is the wind is in, is with you. It's in your sails. So that would be my recommendation. And there's just a lot of opportunity to make stuff that fits that profile.
Hmm. Yeah, that's quite interesting. I think, again, I'm not totally certain, but I would assume that there's been folks out there who focus on green products, maybe because they can make the model work because of a green premium. But that is true, that it seems that anybody who's been on the show who their company is doing well, it tends to be that they both align. It's greener and it's more cost efficient. So it's a no-brainer, right? There's literally no reason to go anywhere else. What was your, I don't know if you either raised venture capital or did bootstrap, but could you talk about the process of either or, whether you raised capital or how you
Yeah,
managed going through the bootstrap process, depending on
sure.
what the answer is there?
Sure. Pat and I had always been bootstrappers. And so when we, even when we had been working on this problem for a little while, we just assumed it would be something that, we would just always have on the side and we would continue to promote, and eventually it would grow and become a nice, recurring revenue service to provide. During the pandemic, when we got, a ton of, new customers, it suddenly was, the two of us were not enough to support it anymore. And we kind of realized that we needed funding to, sustain it. And in order to take things to the next level, because we really believed there was a lot we could build around this kind of core capability that we'd come up with. So in February, so about a year ago, we raised a seed round of venture capital. And that was amazing. I mean, it was hard in the beginning because it was the first time we'd done it. But it was pretty amazing. And then, yeah, so we added a bunch of engineers and a few sales guys, and it's been really fun.
What was the biggest thing you learned throughout that process of raising, and any advice to other founders going through the process of kind of going from, again, a business that in this case was already revenue generating, to then going through that process and talking to investors? Any advice or tips you things you learned?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to say, like, excuse me. It's really hard to say, just believe in yourself without sounding cheesy. But if you go to raise and you've never done it before, you're gonna hear the word no quite a lot. The good thing that I found during the process is that a lot of these funds, even if they said no, they would say, do you want some feedback? Or is there anything I can do to help? Or why don't you talk to this other fund? You might be more in their wheelhouse. So once you get those first few conversations going, at least for me, it made it like the momentum kept like picking up and picking up. And then finally, all of a sudden, before I knew it, we had a round closed. So I would suggest not waiting to do it. Just go do it. Even if nothing happens in the end of it, it is an incredible educational experience. And I think you'd find that a lot of these VC guys and men and women are incredibly generous with their time. We had funds that passed because we didn't fit some part of their thesis, and then I reached back out to them, and they spent more time with me, helping me with my deck and stuff. So that's kind of maybe a touchy-feely take on the process, but I thought it was great.
No, that's good. That's good to hear that, VCs have hearts too, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people give them a bad rep, I think, but I think especially in this space, I think there's a good alignment, right? People are they're investing in companies that need to change the world if they're going to make money. So, they're interested in making sure these companies succeed. I think it can be also tough. I've seen a lot of entrepreneurs who we try to make intros for, and some of them get really upset about getting rejected. Was like, hey, listen, they do have remits, right? They have a specific remit. You might be outside the remit, so it's just about searching for that alignment.
Absolutely.
What is your take on partnerships? You talked a little bit about it before, I think, with the actual package manufacturers, but could you talk about how partnerships have played a role in the growth of the company and how you look at that?
Yeah. So actually, when Pat and I started, we didn't want to talk to customers at all. So the way we built the technology was the hope that other software providers like warehouse management system, shipping system, pack station software, they would just take our API and plug it into their software and make it more contextually relevant for their customers, and we would just focus on the hard math. That didn't end up playing out for multiple reasons. I mean, a lot of these retailers just wanted to have the direct relationship with us, but also a lot of the early partnerships, they didn't know how to sell it, or the sales guys didn't want to complicate a deal that they were working on by introducing this technology they didn't understand. So, and a lot of it was our fault for not doing a better job supporting them and educating them and showing them how it could help their sale and all these things. So there's definitely a lot of lessons learned on partnerships in the early days. I would say lately, I mean, the partnerships we have now are much more exciting, and they have much more to do with an alignment at the point of implementation. So actually, last week, we announced a partnership with a company called Cubiscan, which is basically one of the most advanced companies that makes these dimensioning machines. So you put a stuffed bunny or a whatever cell phone or something on the table, you move the scanner over and it takes perfect dimensions, and it's got all this other metadata and stuff. Anyway, you could imagine how that would be like a perfect alignment. So that's the kind of partnership that I get excited about now, where it's less about like us not wanting to, it's like us leaning on other people to sell our stuff. It's more like, no, where's the kind of the nice dovetail that's really at the heart of a lot of our recent partnerships.
Interesting. I think that's quite fascinating what you talked about, the salespeople not wanting to complicate the sale, because I think that there was a lot of channel sales that can go on. But again, like being in sales, having been in sales myself, I think it's very understandable to know that it can be difficult, especially if it's a new product, because you usually sell things that you're familiar with.
Right.
And they need to be highly familiar with it, but they're not going to be unless they start selling it, right?
Right.
So I think that's a challenging one. That's a challenging one for sure. What about talent acquisition for you? Like what do you, I'm assuming you have some specific need for a highly technical talent, but what has it been like? Do you find a lot of people quite interested in your technology because it is kind of sustainability focused, especially with the layoffs recently? Or do you see a lot of people be like, I don't know, that doesn't seem that sexy. I'm not sure I want to work on it. Like what have you been seeing?
Yeah, so we went, kind of did our hiring spree right after the seed round. And I don't know if it was luck, but everybody we hired was our first choice for the role that they got. And we try not to be too self-conscious about the fact that we're just like putting stuff in boxes well. Like if I have to explain what I do at like a party or something, it kind of comes down to that, and people are just like, okay, fine. But that's another reason why, like, culturally, everybody on my team is so gung-ho about sustainability, because that's what we focused on during the hiring process. we would just say, here's what here's what we've done for these customers. Here's the total potential if every package in the world were to be shipped with Paccurate technology behind it. And yeah, that's really, I think that really, a lot of folks came from companies where they were doing great, but they wanted to have some sort of professional legacy that had a sustainability impact, and that's what we're able to offer right now.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of people who, they want to make a true impact. Like you said, people, even people at the manufacturing level want to make an impact. They may just not know how to do that yet, I think, and giving people an opportunity, especially in a space, conventional, probably considered at least at one point relatively conventional, um, the shipping and logistics space, but there's so much room for innovation. And then you can add the sustainability lens to it. I think it's quite fascinating to see. And obviously the culture aspects is big, right? If you can attract those people and they're top-notch people, then you'll be able to hopefully kind of pull from their networks as well as you continue to grow. Um, I guess just final things to kind of wrap things up here. What is your outlook on the future of this space in general? Do you see any kind of things that to you think they're very obvious that they're going to be changing in the coming years, but maybe not to most people, they're not obvious. So maybe just talk about your outlook on the future a little bit.
Like I kept saying, I'm incredibly optimistic. I think, part of it is I don't think pessimism is useful. And I have children now, and I want to be working on making the future better. So I think optimism is a good, not just for your mental health, but it's a good tool for any entrepreneur who wants to get something done, because the alternative can be, curling into a ball in despair.
Mhm.
But in terms of the industry, I just think, my whole world's supply chain, so I can mostly speak to that. But I think that things that were taken for granted before are suddenly being revisited, and we're part of that wave. Like, 10 years ago, everybody was like, all right, I'm putting stuff in boxes. These boxes I get as cheap as I can, and we get them out the door as fast as possible. Um, there's just like a million problems like that where, we're not just looking for shiny robots and things that are flashy and headline making. Like, no, we're getting back to basics. We're looking at everything from the ground up. So I think it's a great time to be, an entrepreneur working on, business problems like that.
Mm. Yeah, I do find it really interesting because there's so many things that have to be reinvented, right? There's an opportunity for so many people. And I think in particular for those seeking to make an impact, there's probably, I mean, not probably, there's a lot of people in the conventional space who have the, 20, 30 years of knowledge, even not that much, working in this space, who know the problems, they know the intricacies. If they're open to it, they can probably be the best people to, positioned to change them and make them more sustainable. So I think it's really fascinating, honestly.
I say this to my co-founder quite a bit, but like, we are experts. And I can say that because it's not hard to be an expert of an extremely niche problem if
Yeah.
you work on it for long enough. So if you can find your niche, you can become an expert in a very short amount of time. So I highly recommend that as well.
Absolutely. Got to be looking for the opportunity. So very good. Well, this is great. I really enjoyed this. I kind of, as I mentioned at the beginning, have a little bit of a nerd in me that likes to talk about these like nuanced items. Any final things on the like where people can reach you? Anything's coming up like promotion, anything you want to promo, etc.
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm usually there writing about putting things in boxes if that's something that is remotely interesting to you. Um, Happy to chat about sustainability as well. Or Paccurate.io. If there's, I know there's technical folks in your audience, you can actually just start playing with our API for free. So you can go there and get an API key and build some cool stuff. It gets used a lot in hackathons to make like some really weird and interesting things, because it's basically a quick 3D kind of simulation tool. So go check it out.
Very good. I appreciate this. I think you should consider building your brand. I don't know if you follow the My First Million podcast at all, but they've
do.
talked about the guy mafia. I don't know if you know, you should become the sustainable packaging guy on Twitter. I think that'd be great. I definitely would follow you for
Okay.
sure, man. But this has been great. I really enjoyed you coming on the show, and looking forward to seeing what you guys continue to do.
Yeah, thanks so much.
All right, thanks for listening to today's episode with James. If you enjoyed this, please share it with somebody and leave a review. It really helps us grow the show. And definitely reach out and connect with James to learn more about what they're doing. If this is your first time as well, please do subscribe and tap the bell for notifications. And in particular, if you made it this far, please go and subscribe on YouTube. It's very, very helpful for us. All right, next episode. Quick note for our next episode. This is going to be a really fun one. So we're joined by Sean Su from Lower Carbon Capital. And for those unaware, Lower Carbon Capital is the second venture firm from Silicon Valley legend Chris Sacca, who originally founded Lowercase Capital. So I don't know if anybody's familiar with that story. If you're new to venture, Chris Sacca is basically a legend in the space. He's even been on Shark Tank. Really, really, really cool guy. And Sean has a really crazy, cool background in general. He started his early career with Square, helping them expand globally, and then eventually went on to work under Mike Maples at Floodgate. And that was, obviously, Mike Maples is also a kind of a legend in the space as well. And then he made his entry into climate and is now at Lower Carbon Capital. In this episode, he shared a ton of incredible advice and insights from the perspective of a climate tech investor. And you know how he also is spending a lot of time as chief of staff supporting their myriad of portfolio companies. They have a lot of portfolio companies. If you look on their website, I was like scrolling, it felt like for days, but there's so many really cool companies on there. So just anyways, really, really great episode. Really enjoyed this one with Sean. I hope you enjoy this one coming up as well. So thanks again for tuning into the Clean Techies podcast, and we'll see you next time.